In the heart of the city, where the streets were filled with life and the nights never slept, lived a man named Vincent. He was a well-dressed, charismatic man in his late 30s, with an air of mystery that surrounded him. Vincent was a drug lord and had been successfully running his underground empire for a year. The city was his playground, and he reveled in its chaos. One fateful night, Vincent received an anonymous tip that the police were closing in on him. Fear gripped his heart as he realized that his carefully constructed empire was on the brink of collapse. Desperate to save himself and his empire, he made a plan to evade the authorities. His right-hand man, Marco, was the only person he could trust. Together, they devised a strategy to escape the city and lay low in a remote cabin until the heat subsided. They carefully packed their belongings and set out under the cover of darkness, aware that the eyes of the law were never far away. As they made their way through the city's winding alleys and abandoned buildings, they could hear the distant wail of sirens. The police were closing in, and Vincent's heart raced with every step he took. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, as if the ghosts of his past sins had come back to haunt him. "Vincent, we need to keep moving," Marco whispered urgently. I know, Vincent replied, his voice trembling with fear. "Just let me catch my breath." They pressed on, but the sirens grew closer, and soon they could hear the footsteps of police officers echoing through the streets. Vincent's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to escape the tightening noose. Suddenly, a police officer appeared around the corner. Vincent's heart leaped into his throat, but before he could react, Marco stepped forward and spoke to the officer. "Officer, thank God you're here. We've been robbed. They took everything we had and ran off into the darkness." The officer, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked at them skeptically. "You two don't seem like the type to be easily robbed. What's going on here?" Marco's silver tongue spun a convincing tale of an innocent evening gone wrong, and Vincent played along, doing his best to appear like a victim of circumstance. After a tense few minutes, Officer Jenkins seemed to buy their story and let them go with a warning. Relieved, Vincent and Marco resumed their journey, now more cautious than ever. As they moved through the city, the weight of their actions began to press down on Vincent. The faces of those he had harmed in his quest for power haunted him, their eyes filled with accusation and fear. But there was no turning back now. They finally reached the edge of the city and found a stolen car waiting for them. With one last look back at the city that had been his kingdom, Vincent climbed into the driver's seat and sped off into the night. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. Vincent could hear the sirens in his sleep and see the flashing lights whenever he closed his eyes. He was a shell of his former self, a man on the run from his own guilty conscience. Marco did his best to reassure him, but Vincent's fear only grew stronger. He was certain that the police would find him, and the thought of spending the rest of his life behind bars was more than he could bear. Late one evening, as Vincent sat in the cabin, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring into the fire, Marco burst through the door, a look of panic in his eyes. "Vincent, they found proof. The police have hard evidence against you. We have to leave now," Marco exclaimed, his voice shaking. Vincent stared at him, his eyes wide with terror. "What? How? How did they find out?" "I don't know," Marco replied, his voice cracking. "But we don't have much time. We need to pack up and go." Desperation clawed at Vincent's mind as he realized that his time was running out. He had escaped the police once, but he knew that he wouldn't be so lucky a second time. His heart raced, his thoughts racing faster than he could comprehend. As they frantically packed their belongings, Vincent's mind raced with thoughts of how he could save himself. He couldn't face the consequences of his actions, the shame and degradation of being exposed as a drug lord. His life, his reputation, everything he had built, would be ruined. In a moment of clarity, Vincent knew what he had to do. He pulled Marco aside, his voice trembling. "Marco, listen to me. I can't run anymore. I can't live like this, with the fear and guilt hanging over me. I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Vincent," Marco replied, his eyes filled with concern. "I need you to make sure that no one ever finds out the truth, that no one ever knows about the people I hurt or the lives I ruined," Vincent pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. Marco hesitated for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I promise, Vincent. Your secret will die with you. With a deep breath, Vincent made his decision. He wrote a brief letter, confessing to his crimes and begging for forgiveness from those he had wronged. Then, before the police could arrive and find any other evidence that would connect him to his dark empire or his associates, he took his own life. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing ever closer as the police descended upon the remote cabin. Marco, heartbroken and torn, watched as Vincent's lifeless body slumped to the floor. He knew that his friend's soul would be forever haunted by the phantom of guilt, a specter that would never let him rest in peace. As the police burst through the door, Marco clutched Vincent's letter to his chest, determined to keep his promise. He stared at the officers, his eyes filled with defiance and grief, as they arrested him for his role in Vincent's crimes. In the end, Vincent's empire crumbled, and the city he had once ruled with an iron fist was left to pick up the pieces. The truth of his dark deeds would remain a secret, buried deep beneath the weight of a guilty conscience and the unwavering loyalty of a friend. But even in death, the phantom of guilt would continue to haunt Vincent's soul, a chilling reminder of the price of power and the consequences of the choices we make. When you subscribe, be sure to click the notification bell. Click here for more true scary stories.